After 48 years, 1976 tapos in 2024, the construction crew's sledgehammer broke through the concrete floor of the old garage on Maple Street, and what they found in the hidden pit beneath would finally answer a question that had haunted the small town of Willowbrook, Ohio, for nearly 5 decades. A rusted bicycle frame, a faded denim jacket with the name Calvin stitched inside, and secrets that had been buried since 1976 were about to see daylight for the first time. Warren Flint had been dead for 12 years, but his crimes were about to catch up with him in ways nobody could have predicted. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of October 14th, 1976, started like any other Thursday in Willowbrook. Calvin Brooks woke up at 5:30 in the morning to the sound of his alarm clock rattling on the nightstand beside his bed. The 14-year-old boy had been doing the morning paper route for the Willowbrook Gazette for almost 8 months now, saving up money for a new baseball glove and maybe, if he was lucky, a 10-speed bicycle by Christmas. His mother, Patricia Brooks, heard him moving around upstairs and smiled to herself as she prepared his breakfast in the kitchen below. Calvin was responsible, always had been. Never missed a day of his route, even when the weather turned nasty, or when his friends tried to convince him to skip out and go to the creek instead. Patricia had scrambled eggs waiting for him when he came downstairs, his sandy blonde hair still messy from sleep, his green eyes squinting against the kitchen light. He wore his usual outfit for the route, a pair of worn jeans, a red flannel shirt, and his prized denim jacket that his grandmother had embroidered his name on the inside collar last year for his 13th birthday. Calvin ate quickly, shoveling the eggs into his mouth, while his mother reminded him to be home by 7:30, so he wouldn't be late for school. He nodded, his mouth too full to respond properly, and she ruffled his hair affectionately before he grabbed his canvas newspaper bag from the hook by the back door. The October air was crisp and cool, the kind of morning where you could see your breath in little clouds. And Calvin loaded his bicycle basket with the stack of newspapers that had been dropped off at the corner of his street an hour earlier. His route covered 12 blocks of residential streets in the eastern part of Willowbrook, a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business and front doors were rarely locked. He had 42 customers on his list, and he prided himself on getting every paper onto every porch by 6:45, giving himself just enough time to get home, change, and make it to Willowbrook Middle School before the first bell rang at 8:15. Calvin started his route on Sycamore Street, tossing papers with practiced accuracy onto porches and into screen doors. Mrs. Henderson at number 12 always left him a quarter tip on Thursdays, tucked under her doormat. And sure enough, when he reached her house, the coin was waiting. He pocketed it with a grin and continued on, his bicycle tires crunching over fallen leaves that covered the sidewalks in patches of orange and brown. By 6:15, he had covered Sycamore and moved on to Oak Avenue, then Birch Lane, checking off houses in his mental list as he went. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon when Calvin turned onto Maple Street, the quieter end of his route where the houses were more spread out and set back from the road. This was usually his last stretch before heading home, and he was making good time. The third house on Maple belonged to Old Man Henderson, no relation to the Mrs. Henderson who tipped him, and Calvin tossed the paper underhand, watching it land perfectly on the welcome mat. He was about to pedal on when he noticed Warren Flint standing in the open doorway of his garage across the street. Warren Flint was not someone most people in Willowbrook wanted to interact with if they could help it. The 38-year-old mechanic lived alone in a sagging 2-story house that needed paint and repairs, and he ran a small automotive repair business out of the detached garage beside it. He had a reputation for being odd, keeping strange hours, and having a temper that could flare up over nothing. Parents warned their children to stay away from Flint's property, though nobody could point to any specific reason beyond a general sense of unease. He had lived in Willowbrook his whole life, never married, barely spoke to his neighbors, and seemed content to exist on the fringes of the community. Calvin had delivered papers to Flint's mailbox dozens of times without incident, usually just tossing the paper from the street and moving on. But this morning, Flint was waving him over, gesturing toward the garage with an urgency that made Calvin hesitate. The man was wearing grease-stained coveralls and work boots, his dark hair slicked back from his forehead, and even from across the street, Calvin could see him calling out something, though the words didn't quite carry. Every instinct told Calvin to just keep riding, to pretend he hadn't seen the man and finish his route. But he had been raised to be polite, to help neighbors when they needed it, and Flint was technically a customer even if he gave Calvin the creeps. So Calvin walked his bicycle across the street, stopping at the edge of Flint's driveway, keeping a safe distance between himself and the garage. Flint's voice was rough, like he had been smoking too many cigarettes, and he explained that his truck wouldn't start, that he needed to get to a job across town and was already late, and could Calvin possibly help him push the vehicle out of the garage so he could take a look at the engine in better light. It was an odd request, especially at 6:30 in the morning, and Calvin felt that uncomfortable prickling sensation at the back of his neck that told him something wasn't right. He made an excuse about needing to finish his route and get to school, started to back away, but Flint's expression changed, hardened, and he stepped forward with a speed that caught Calvin completely off guard. What happened next would remain a mystery for 48 years. Locked away in the darkness of that garage, hidden beneath layers of concrete and deception, Calvin's bicycle was found later that morning, lying on its side at the edge of Flint's driveway, newspapers scattered across the gravel. His canvas delivery bag was still looped over the handlebars, most of the papers still inside, undelivered. The last house to receive a paper that morning was Old Man Henderson's, and everything after that was silence. Patricia Brooks began to worry when Calvin didn't come home by 7:30. She called the school at 8:30 when he didn't show up for first period. By 9 o'clock, she had contacted the Willowbrook Police Department, and by 9:30, officers were canvassing Calvin's paper route, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen the boy. It was Mrs. Callahan, who lived 2 houses down from Warren Flint on Maple Street, who mentioned seeing Calvin's bicycle in Flint's driveway around 6:30 that morning. She had been up early with her colicky baby and happened to glance out the window, noticed the red bicycle with the basket. Thought it was odd, but didn't think much of it at the time. Detective Raymond Pierce was assigned to the case, a 20-year veteran of the Willowbrook Police Department who had seen his share of missing children over the years. Most of them turned up within hours, runaways who got cold and scared and came home on their own, or kids who had gone to a friend's house and lost track of time. But something about Calvin's disappearance felt different from the start. The boy had no reason to run away, was by all accounts happy and well-adjusted, and the abandoned bicycle with the newspapers still in the bag suggested he hadn't left of his own accord. Pierce and his partner, Officer Janet Holloway, went to interview Warren Flint that afternoon. They found him in his garage, working on an engine, his hands black with grease. When they asked if he had seen Calvin Brooks that morning, Flint barely looked up from his work. He said, "Yeah, the kid had stopped by for a minute, wanted to know if Flint needed any odd jobs done for extra money." Flint told him no, said the boy had ridden off toward the end of Maple Street to finish his route, and that was the last he saw of him. His tone was casual, unbothered, and when Pierce pressed him about why Calvin's bicycle had been found in his driveway, Flint shrugged and said the kid must have come back for some reason, maybe forgot something. How should he know? There was something off about Warren Flint's demeanor, something that made both Pierce and Holloway exchange glances. But being uncomfortable around someone wasn't the same as having evidence of a crime. They asked if they could search the property, and Flint agreed without hesitation, even seemed amused by the request. They spent 2 hours going through the garage, the house, the yard, looking for any sign of Calvin or evidence of foul play. They found nothing. The garage was cluttered with tools and car parts and old furniture, but nothing that raised red flags. The house was a mess. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, unmade bed, but no indication that a teenage boy had been there. Over the next several weeks, the search for Calvin Brooks consumed Willowbrook. Volunteers combed through the woods surrounding the town, checked abandoned buildings, dragged the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the community. Patricia Brooks appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for information, begging whoever had her son to bring him home safely. Calvin's father, Robert Brooks, who had been working construction in Cincinnati and was separated from Patricia, came back to Willowbrook and joined the search efforts, putting up flyers with Calvin's picture on every telephone pole and storefront window in a 20-mile radius. Detective Pierce couldn't shake his suspicion of Warren Flint. Everything about the man's behavior that day rang false. The too casual responses, the lack of concern, the way his story about Calvin asking for odd jobs didn't match what people who knew the boy said about his character. Calvin had a job, had his paper route, didn't need to go around begging for work. Pierce went back to Flint's property multiple times over the following months, always with a warrant, always searching for something, anything that would give him probable cause to dig deeper. But Flint was careful, never slipped up, never gave them an opening. The case went cold within 6 months. Without a body, without physical evidence, without witnesses who saw anything concrete, there was nothing to pursue. Warren Flint became the unofficial prime suspect in the minds of everyone in Willowbrook, the man parents pointed to when warning their children about strangers. But legally, he was untouchable. He continued to live in his ramshackle house on Maple Street, continued to work on cars in his garage, seemed utterly unmoved by the fact that an entire town believed he was responsible for a child's disappearance. Patricia Brooks never gave up hope, not really, though as the years passed and Calvin's 14th birthday became his 15th, then his 20th, then his 30th, the hope transformed into something else, a kind of resigned grief mixed with anger at the injustice of it all. She kept Calvin's room exactly as he had left it that October morning, his bed made, his baseball cards in a shoebox under the bed, his school books stacked on the desk by the window. Every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, she placed a new advertisement in the Willowbrook Gazette, asking for information, offering a reward that grew from $500 to $5,000 over the decades. Warren Flint died in 2012 at the age of 74, his heart giving out while he was working under a car in his garage, which seemed like a fitting end for a man who had spent his entire life in that space. He left no will, no family to claim his property, and the house and garage sat empty for years, slowly deteriorating, becoming an eyesore that the town council debated what to do with. Some people wanted it torn down immediately, wanted to erase the physical reminder of the man they believed had stolen Calvin Brooks from them. Others argued it should be preserved as potential evidence, that maybe someday technology would advance enough to find something investigators in 1976 had missed. In the end, bureaucracy and budget constraints kept the property in limbo for over a decade. It wasn't until 2023 that the town finally allocated funds to demolish the structures and clear the lot, planning to turn the space into a small community park. The demolition was contracted to Hendricks Construction, a local company that had been in business for 40 years, and they scheduled the work to begin in March of 2024. The crew that arrived on the morning of March 7, 2024, consisted of 4 men, a supervisor named Gary Hendricks, and 3 workers who had been with the company for years. They started with the house, which came down relatively easily, old wood and plaster that practically crumbled under the weight of the excavator. The garage was next, and it proved to be more stubborn. The concrete floor and foundation poured thicker than expected, requiring more intensive work to break through. It was 19-year-old Marcus Webb, the youngest member of the crew, who first noticed that the concrete in one section of the garage floor sounded different when struck with a sledgehammer. Instead of the solid thud of concrete meeting earth, there was a hollow echo, subtle but unmistakable. He called Gary over, and they spent the next hour carefully breaking away the concrete in that area, revealing a space underneath, a pit roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet long that had been dug into the earth and then covered over. What they found inside that pit would bring Detective Raymond Pierce, now 72 years old and long retired, back to Willowbrook for the first time in 5 years. The bicycle frame was the first thing visible, red paint still clinging to the metal in spots despite decades of moisture and rust. Beside it, folded carefully, was a denim jacket, and when Gary Hendricks lifted it gently from the pit, he could see the embroidered name on the inside collar, faded but legible: Calvin. The Willowbrook Police Department secured the scene within an hour of the discovery. The current chief, Linda Morrison, had been a rookie officer in 1976, remembered the Calvin Brooks case, remembered the frustration of watching Warren Flint walk free despite everyone's certainty of his guilt. She called in the State Crime Scene Investigation Unit, made sure every inch of that pit was photographed and documented before anything was removed. Along with the bicycle and jacket, they found bones, small and fragile, scattered across the bottom of the pit, mixed with dirt and decay. A forensic anthropologist confirmed on site that the remains were human, consistent with a juvenile male, and the medical examiner who arrived later that afternoon carefully extracted every fragment for transport to the state lab. The news spread through Willowbrook like wildfire, and by that evening, The national media had picked up the story. A cold case solved nearly 50 years later, a missing child found buried beneath the garage of the man everyone had suspected all along. It was the kind of story that captured public attention and refused to let go. Patricia Brooks, now 78 years old and living in a nursing home in Columbus, was notified by Chief Morrison personally. The years had not been kind to Patricia. The not knowing had eaten away at her health and peace of mind, and when Morrison told her they had found Calvin, she wept with a mixture of relief and renewed grief that was almost unbearable to witness. The DNA testing took 6 weeks, modern technology applied to decades-old evidence, and when the results came back, they confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains in the pit belonged to Calvin James Brooks, age 14 at the time of death, missing since October 14, 1976. But the DNA testing revealed something else, something that finally, definitively, tied Warren Flint to the crime in a way that would have stood up in court if he had still been alive to face trial. Forensic analysts found DNA on the denim jacket that didn't belong to Calvin. Skin cells and hair follicles preserved in the fabric fibers, protected from complete degradation by the layers of concrete that had sealed the pit. The DNA was run through databases, compared against samples taken from Warren Flint's medical records after his death, records that had been subpoenaed as part of the renewed investigation. The match was conclusive, 99.9% probability that Warren Flint's DNA was on Calvin Brooks' jacket. Further analysis of the remains revealed cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull, a pattern of fractures consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. The medical examiner estimated Calvin had died within hours of his disappearance, meaning he had been in that garage, alive but injured, while his mother was calling the police. While volunteers were organizing search parties, while Detective Pierce was interviewing Flint for the first time. The investigation into exactly what had happened that October morning was pieced together through evidence and reasonable reconstruction. Calvin had likely been struck when he was in or near the garage, possibly when he tried to leave after realizing Flint's request for help was a pretense for something darker. The attack had been brutal, but not immediately fatal, and at some point, Flint had moved the boy's bicycle to the driveway to make it look like Calvin had left the property. Then, he had gone back into the garage, finished what he started, and spent the rest of that day and probably several days after digging the pit, burying the evidence, pouring concrete over it in sections to avoid suspicion. The why of it remained speculation, because Warren Flint had taken his motives to the grave. Some psychologists consulted by the investigation suggested he might have been a predator who saw an opportunity, a young boy alone and vulnerable. Others thought it might have been an impulse crime. Something about Calvin that morning triggered rage or violence in Flint, and he acted without planning. The truth was, it didn't matter much in the end. Whatever twisted reasoning had led Warren Flint to take a 14-year-old boy's life, the result was the same: a family destroyed, a community traumatized, and a secret kept for 48 years. The public reaction to the case being solved was intense and multifaceted. There was relief that the mystery had finally been answered, that Patricia Brooks would be able to bury her son properly and have some measure of closure. There was anger that justice would never truly be served, that Flint had died peacefully in his garage instead of facing trial and spending his remaining years in prison. There was guilt among some residents who had suspected Flint, but never pushed harder, never demanded more investigation, accepted the lack of evidence as an endpoint rather than a challenge to look deeper. Detective Raymond Pierce gave an interview to the Willowbrook Gazette in April of 2024, his first public comments on the case in over 3 decades. He was a frail man now, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke, but his voice was clear and firm when he talked about Calvin Brooks. He said he had never stopped thinking about the case, that it had haunted him throughout his career and into retirement, that he had known Warren Flint was guilty but hadn't been able to prove it with the tools available at the time. He expressed gratitude that modern forensic science had finally provided the answers he couldn't obtain 48 years ago, but also regret that it had taken so long that Calvin's family had suffered for decades without resolution. The funeral for Calvin Brooks was held on May 3, 2024, a sunny spring day that felt incongruous with the somber occasion. Hundreds of people attended, including many who had been children themselves in 1976 and remembered Calvin as a classmate or neighbor. and others who were too young to have any personal connection, but came to pay respects to a story that had become part of Willowbrook's collective memory. Patricia Brooks sat in the front row, flanked by Calvin's father Robert, who had remarried and moved to Florida years ago, but returned for this final goodbye, and Calvin's younger sister Margaret, who had been only 8 years old when her brother disappeared and had spent most of her adult life trying to reconcile the loss. The service was simple. A pastor from the Methodist church where the Brooks family had attended when Calvin was alive spoke about loss and faith and the importance of finally being able to lay a loved one to rest. Patricia had chosen a closed casket, the remains too fragmentary to be viewed, but she had placed a framed photograph on top. Calvin, at 13 in his school picture, his smile bright and his eyes full of the future he would never get to have. She read a letter she had written to her son, her voice breaking multiple times, telling him how much she loved him, how she had never stopped looking for him, how she hoped he was at peace now. The case officially closed on June 15, 2024, with a press conference held by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and the Willowbrook Police Department. They presented their findings, the DNA evidence, the forensic analysis, the timeline of events, everything that supported the conclusion that Warren Flint had murdered Calvin Brooks and hidden his body in a pit beneath his garage floor. Chief Morrison announced that the case was being marked as solved by homicide, perpetrator deceased, and that the investigation was being archived. But the story didn't end with the official closure, because stories like this never really end. They just transform into something else, becoming part of the fabric of a community's history, a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how evil can hide in plain sight. The lot where Warren Flint's house and garage once stood was eventually turned into the park the town had planned, but they added a memorial, a simple stone bench with a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Calvin James Brooks, 1962 to 1976, forever young, forever remembered." Patricia Brooks lived for another 2 years after her son's funeral, passing away peacefully in her sleep in July of 2026 at the age of 80. Those who knew her said the closure had given her a kind of peace she hadn't known in decades, that being able to bury Calvin and know what had happened to him had lifted a weight she had carried for far too long. She was buried beside her son in Willowbrook Cemetery, their headstones side by side, reunited at last. The case generated renewed interest in other cold cases from the same era, led to improvements in how missing children cases were handled, pushed for better documentation and evidence preservation in case future technology could provide answers. Current methods couldn't. Several other jurisdictions reopened old files, began re-examining evidence with modern forensic techniques, hoping to provide closure to families who had been waiting just as long as the Brooks family had. In Willowbrook itself, the Calvin Brooks case became a turning point in how the community viewed safety and vigilance. The casual attitude of leaving doors unlocked and children unsupervised disappeared, replaced by a wariness that some older residents lamented as the loss of simpler times, but that most people recognized as necessary adaptation to an uncomfortable reality. Parents told their children about Calvin, not to frighten them, but to educate them, to make them understand the importance of trusting their instincts and getting help when something felt wrong. The Willowbrook Gazette ran a special edition on the 25th anniversary of the case's resolution in 2049, featuring interviews with people who had been involved in the original investigation, family members, community members who remembered that October morning in 1976. Margaret Brooks, Calvin's sister, who was now in her 50s with children and grandchildren of her own, contributed an essay about growing up in the shadow of her brother's disappearance and the complex emotions that came with finally knowing the truth. She wrote about how she had idealized Calvin in her memory, turned him into a kind of perfect ghost that no real person could have lived up to, and how the resolution of the case had allowed her to remember him as he actually was, a regular kid who liked baseball and complained about homework and sometimes teased her, but also protected her from neighborhood bullies. The forensic team that had worked on the DNA analysis published papers about the case in scientific journals, using it as an example of how preserved evidence from decades past could still yield results with advancing technology. They detailed the process of extracting usable DNA from the fabric and bone fragments, the challenges of working with degraded samples, the techniques they had developed to maximize the chances of obtaining a profile. The case became a teaching tool in forensic science programs, a real-world example of patience and persistence paying off. Detective Raymond Pierce passed away in 2028 at the age of 76, and his obituary in the Willowbrook Gazette prominently mentioned his work on the Calvin Brooks case, both the original investigation and his cooperation with the team that finally solved it. His family said he had kept a file on Calvin in his home office even after retirement, continued to review it periodically, never truly let it go. At his funeral, Chief Morrison gave a eulogy in which she talked about Pierce's dedication to finding the truth, his refusal to simply accept that some cases would remain mysteries, his belief that every victim deserved justice even if it took a lifetime to achieve. The demolition company, Hendricks Construction, found itself at the center of attention. For a while after the discovery, with Gary Hendricks and his crew giving multiple interviews about the moment they found the pit. Gary said it was the kind of thing that changes you, knowing you've uncovered something that had been hidden for so long that your work had inadvertently brought answers to a family that desperately needed them. Marcus Webb, the young worker who first noticed the hollow sound in the concrete, said he had nightmares for months afterward, kept seeing that pit in his dreams, but he was also proud to have played a part in solving the case, however accidental his role had been. The national media coverage of the case sparked debates about the statute of limitations for murder, whether it mattered that the perpetrator was already dead, whether there was value in solving cases when legal justice was no longer possible. Most people agreed that while it was frustrating Warren Flint would never face trial, the closure for the victim's family was its own form of justice, that knowing the truth was better than living with uncertainty. Some victims' rights advocates used the case to push for better resources for cold case investigations, arguing that families deserved answers regardless of how much time had passed. In Willowbrook, Warren Flint's name became synonymous with evil, spoken in hushed tones, used as a reference point for the worst kind of person. His property, even after being cleared and converted to a park, carried a stigma for years. Some people avoided it entirely, uncomfortable with the idea of relaxing in a space where such horrible things had happened. Others made a point of using the park frequently, treating it as a kind of reclamation, taking back the space from its dark history and filling it with life and light and the laughter of children playing safely. The memorial bench became a place where people left flowers on Calvin's birthday and on the anniversary of his disappearance, a tradition that started spontaneously and continued for years. Teenagers from Willowbrook High School adopted the memorial as a service project, keeping the area clean and well-maintained, planting flowers around the bench every spring. It became a spot where people would sit and reflect, think about the fragility of life and the importance of holding loved ones close. Calvin's story was featured in true crime podcasts, documentary series, books about famous cold cases. Each retelling brought renewed attention to the details, the 48-year gap between crime and resolution, the DNA evidence that finally provided proof, the tragedy of a promising young life cut short. Some treatments were respectful and thoughtful, focusing on Calvin as a person and the impact of his loss on the community. Others were more sensationalistic, dwelling on the gruesome details and speculating about Warren Flint's psychology in ways that bordered on exploitation. The Brooks family, particularly Margaret and her children, had to navigate the strange experience of having their private tragedy become public property. Margaret gave selective interviews to outlets she trusted, trying to maintain control over her brother's narrative, ensuring he was remembered as more than just a victim. She shared stories about Calvin's sense of humor, his kindness to animals, his dreams of playing professional baseball someday, trying to create a three-dimensional picture of who he had been rather than letting him be reduced to a headline. The impact on Willowbrook's identities was profound and lasting. The town had always been the kind of place that prided itself on being safe and close-knit, where everyone knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. Calvin's disappearance had shattered that illusion in 1976, forcing residents to confront the reality that danger could exist anywhere, that trust could be misplaced, that safety was never guaranteed. The resolution of the case nearly 5 decades later brought those feelings back to the surface, made people re-examine their assumptions about the past and their sense of security in the present. Local historians began documenting the case in detail, conducting oral history interviews with people who remembered the original investigation, preserving newspaper clippings and police reports, creating an archive that would serve as a resource for future generations. The Willowbrook Historical Society dedicated an entire section of their museum to the case, displaying Calvin's school photo, copies of the missing person flyers, articles about the search efforts, and eventually, information about the case's resolution. It was a delicate balance, honoring Calvin's memory without glorifying the crime or the criminal who had taken his life. In the years following the case's resolution, there were occasional developments that kept the story in public consciousness. In 2030, a journalist writing a book about the case obtained access to Warren Flint's medical records and discovered he had been institutionalized briefly in 1968 for violent behavior, had attacked a coworker at a factory where he worked before becoming a mechanic. The information had never been part of the original investigation because the records were sealed and Flint had never been convicted of a crime, but it added another layer to the picture of who he had been. Suggested that the violence that ended Calvin's life hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. In 2035, advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to re-examine some of the evidence from the pit and determine more precisely when the concrete had been poured over it. Analysis of the concrete itself, studying the composition and curing patterns, suggested it had been done in stages over several weeks, meaning Flint had been methodical and careful, taking his time to ensure the pit was completely concealed. This information matched with witness statements from 1976 that Flint's garage had been closed for a period in November of that year, with him telling neighbors he was working on a big project and didn't want to be disturbed. The psychological profile of Warren Flint, assembled by experts who studied the case after its resolution, painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual who had likely been fantasizing about violence for years before acting on it. His isolated lifestyle, his inability to form normal social connections, his history of angry outbursts, all fit the pattern of someone capable of extreme violence. The fact that he had apparently only acted once, or at least only been caught once, was unusual but not unheard of. Some serial offenders committed only a single crime, either because they were satisfied by it, because they were frightened by their own capacity for violence, or because they got lucky and weren't caught, which reinforced their ability to hide what they had done. For Patricia Brooks' surviving family, the resolution of the case was both ending and beginning. Margaret Brooks struggled with complex emotions in the years following the discovery, grateful to finally have answers, but also angry at all the time that had been lost, all the years her mother had suffered not knowing. She sought therapy to process her feelings, joined a support group for family members of murder victims, found solace in connecting with others who understood the unique pain of losing someone to violence. Her children, Calvin's nieces and nephews, who had never met him, but had grown up hearing stories about him, developed their own relationships with his memory. Some became advocates for victims' rights, working with organizations that supported families of missing and murdered children. Others went into law enforcement or forensic science, inspired by the dedication of the people who had worked to solve their great-uncle's case. The tragedy that had defined their grandmother's life and shaped their mother's childhood became a catalyst for positive action, a way of honoring Calvin by trying to prevent similar tragedies or help solve them when they occurred. The town of Willowbrook itself underwent changes in the decades following the case's resolution, growing from a small community of a few thousand to a more substantial suburb as nearby Columbus expanded. New residents moved in, people who had no personal connection to Calvin Brooks or memory of the original investigation, and the case became history rather than lived experience. But the old-timers made sure the story wasn't forgotten, that newcomers learned about what had happened, that Calvin's memorial in the park was maintained and respected. In 2040, the Willowbrook School District incorporated the Calvin Brooks case into their safety curriculum, using it as a teaching tool to help children understand the importance of being aware of their surroundings, trusting their instincts, and telling adults when something made them uncomfortable. It was handled carefully, age-appropriately, not meant to frighten children, but to empower them with knowledge and strategies for staying safe. Margaret Brooks was consulted on the curriculum and gave her blessing, said she thought Calvin would have liked the idea that his story might help protect other kids. The park where Calvin's memorial stood became a gathering place for the community, hosting concerts and festivals, serving as a venue for farmers' markets and craft fairs, transforming from a site of tragedy into a space of life and connection. On the anniversary of Calvin's death each October, the town held a remembrance ceremony, a brief gathering where people could come together to honor his memory and reflect on the importance of community vigilance and support for families of missing persons. As the 50th anniversary of Calvin's disappearance approached in 2026, planning began for a more substantial commemoration. The town commissioned a sculpture to be placed near the memorial bench, a bronze figure of a young boy on a bicycle, captured in a moment of joy and motion, representing Calvin as he had been in life, rather than focusing on how he had died. The sculpture was unveiled on October 14th, 2026, exactly 50 years after Calvin had ridden his bicycle down Maple Street for the last time. The unveiling ceremony was attended by hundreds, including Margaret Brooks and her extended family, retired law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, members of the construction crew who had discovered the pit, forensic scientists who had analyzed the evidence, and community members spanning multiple generations. The mayor of Willowbrook gave a speech about resilience and remembrance, about how the community had been forever changed by Calvin's loss, but had also come together in the aftermath, supporting each other through the darkest times and celebrating together when answers finally came. Margaret unveiled the sculpture herself, pulling back the cloth covering to reveal the bronze boy forever frozen at age 14, forever riding toward a future he would never reach. She spoke briefly, her voice trembling but strong, thanking everyone who had never given up on finding the truth, who had kept her brother's memory alive, who had supported her family through decades of uncertainty and grief. She said Calvin had loved riding his bicycle, had loved the freedom and speed of it, and she hoped this sculpture would capture that joy rather than the tragedy of what had followed. In the years since the case's resolution, it had become a touchstone for discussions about cold cases, victim advocacy, forensic advancement, and community trauma. It was cited in legislative hearings about funding for unsolved case investigations, referenced in training materials for law enforcement, featured in documentaries about the evolution of forensic science. Calvin Brooks had become more than a boy who had disappeared on a paper route in 1976. He had become a symbol of why persistence mattered, why families deserved answers, why justice delayed was still justice worth pursuing. The final chapter of the story, if any story about such tragedy can truly have a final chapter, came in the form of a scholarship established in Calvin's name by the Willowbrook Community Foundation. The Calvin Brooks Memorial Scholarship was awarded annually to a graduating senior from Willowbrook High School who demonstrated qualities Calvin had been known for: responsibility, kindness, dedication to helping others. The scholarship was funded by donations from community members, with the first award given in 2025, and it continued to provide educational opportunities for young people who embodied the best of what Calvin had represented. The recipients of the scholarship were chosen not just for academic achievement, but for character, for the ways they contributed to their community and looked out for others. Each year at the awards ceremony, held in the high school auditorium, Margaret Brooks or another family member would speak about Calvin, would remind the audience that he had been a real person with dreams and plans, not just a name on a memorial or a case file. They would talk about how he had saved his paper route money, how he had helped neighbors, how he had been kind to younger kids, trying to inspire the scholarship recipients to carry forward that legacy of goodness. As the decades passed and the people who had known Calvin personally grew older and eventually passed away themselves, the story evolved from living memory into historical record. But the core of it remained: a 14-year-old boy who had been taken too soon, a family that had never stopped fighting for answers, a community that had been forever changed, and a case that had finally, after 48 years, been solved through the combination of old-fashioned detective work and modern forensic science. The hidden pit beneath Warren Flint's garage, the bicycle and jacket carefully preserved in that dark space, the DNA evidence that had survived decades of degradation. All of it had come together to provide the truth that had been buried along with Calvin's remains. And while justice in the traditional sense had been impossible because the perpetrator was long dead, there was justice in the answering itself, in the knowledge finally gained, in the ability to lay a child to rest and mark his grave with certainty rather than hope. The story of Calvin Brooks was a reminder that some questions haunted us not because we feared the answers, but because we needed them, needed to know what had happened and why, needed to close the circle that tragedy had opened. It was a testament to the families who refused to give up, to the investigators who carried cold cases in their hearts long after retiring, to the communities that never forgot their lost children. And it was a warning, clear and stark, that evil could hide anywhere, that vigilance was necessary, that the safety of children required constant attention and care. In the end, 50 years after that October morning, when Calvin Brooks rode his bicycle down Maple Street toward an encounter that would end his life, the truth had emerged from beneath the concrete, brought into light by the accidental discovery of construction workers who had no idea what they were about to find. The case was solved, the mystery answered, the boy finally brought home to rest beside his mother, who had never stopped loving him, never stopped searching for him, never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, she would know what had happened to her son. And in that knowing, painful as it was, there was finally peace. The aftermath of the case's resolution rippled outward in ways that continued to surprise people even years later. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist who had worked on analyzing Calvin's remains, found herself speaking at conferences around the world about the case, using it as an example of how preservation of evidence, even accidental preservation, could lead to breakthroughs decades later. She detailed how the concrete seal over the pit had actually helped maintain the integrity of the DNA samples, creating a relatively stable environment that prevented complete degradation. Without that seal, she explained to audiences of fellow scientists and law enforcement professionals, the evidence might have been destroyed by exposure to moisture, insects, and bacterial action that would have broken down the biological material beyond any hope of analysis. The case also prompted a comprehensive review of other unsolved disappearances in Ohio during the 1970s. State investigators compiled a list of 37 children who had vanished during that decade and whose cases remained open. They began the painstaking process of cross-referencing those cases with known offenders from the era, looking for patterns or connections that might have been missed with the investigative techniques available at the time. 3 of those cases showed similarities to Calvin's disappearance: children who had vanished while doing routine activities in small towns, last seen in proximity to men who lived alone and had reputations for being odd or antisocial. One case in particular caught the attention of investigators: the disappearance of 11-year-old Jessica Parker from the town of Riverside, about 60 miles from Willowbrook, in August of 1974. Jessica had been riding her bicycle to a friend's house and never arrived. Her bicycle was found abandoned near the property of a reclusive man named Dale Kovacs, who had been questioned extensively at the time, but never charged. Kovacs had died in 1998, and his property had been sold multiple times since then. The current owners, when contacted by investigators looking into potential connections to the Calvin Brooks case, agreed to allow a search of their property, particularly the old barn that Kovacs had used as a workshop. The search of the former Kovacs property took place in September of 2024, 6 months after Calvin's remains had been discovered. A ground-penetrating radar survey of the barn revealed an anomaly beneath the dirt floor in one corner, similar to what might be expected if a pit had been dug and filled in. The excavation that followed was careful and methodical, with forensic teams documenting every layer of soil removed. At a depth of approximately 5 feet, they found bones, a child's clothing, and a silver bracelet that Jessica Parker's mother identified from photographs as belonging to her daughter. The discovery sent shockwaves through Ohio law enforcement and provided devastating closure to the Parker family, who had been waiting 50 years for answers just as the Brooks family had. DNA testing confirmed the remains were Jessica's, and while the evidence was not as conclusive as in Calvin's case, there were enough similarities in the method of burial and concealment to suggest the possibility that Dale Kovacs and Warren Flint might have known each other, might have even shared information about their crimes. Investigators dug into records from the 1970s, looking for any connection between the two men, and found that both had attended a series of automotive trade shows in Cleveland between 1972 and 1975, events that drew mechanics and car enthusiasts from across the region. Whether Kovacs and Flint had actually known each other, or if their similar methods were simply coincidental, was never definitively determined. But the discovery of Jessica Parker's remains, prompted directly by the resolution of Calvin's case, brought closure to another family and reinforced the importance of never giving up on cold cases, no matter how much time had passed. The Parker family held a funeral for Jessica in October of 2024, and Margaret Brooks attended, standing in solidarity with another family who had endured the same kind of prolonged grief and uncertainty that had defined her own life. The media coverage of the two connected cases intensified public interest in cold case investigations across the country. Police departments in multiple states reported increases in funding requests for cold case units, and several jurisdictions that had disbanded such units due to budget cuts began reconsidering those decisions. The argument was compelling. Advances in technology meant that cases once thought unsolvable might now yield answers. And the families of victims deserved those answers regardless of how much time had elapsed. In Willowbrook, the revelation that Calvin's case might have been part of a larger pattern of crimes rather than an isolated incident changed how people thought about what had happened. There was something almost worse about imagining Warren Flint as part of a network of predators, comparing notes and methods, than thinking of him as a lone monster. It suggested a level of calculation and deliberation that was deeply disturbing. The idea that he had planned and prepared, possibly even practiced his techniques on other victims, or learned from others who had. The Willowbrook Police Department received a grant in 2025 to establish a dedicated cold case unit, the first in the town's history. Chief Morrison appointed Detective Marcus Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the force who had been instrumental in coordinating with state investigators on the Calvin Brooks case, to head the new unit. Rodriguez's first task was to review all unsolved cases from the town's history, creating a prioritized list based on the likelihood that modern forensic techniques could provide new leads. There were 17 unsolved disappearances or suspicious deaths in Willowbrook's records going back to 1950, and Rodriguez was determined to bring resolution to as many as possible. One of the cases Rodriguez focused on early was the disappearance of Angela Martinez, a 23-year-old waitress who had vanished in 1982 after finishing her shift at a diner on the outskirts of Willowbrook. Angela's car had been found abandoned on a rural road, her purse still inside. No sign of struggle, but also no indication of where she had gone or what had happened to her. The case had been investigated thoroughly at the time, but without physical evidence or witnesses, it had eventually gone cold. Rodriguez wondered if there might be a connection to Warren Flint, given the timeline and location, and began pulling records to see if Flint had ever been questioned in relation to Angela's disappearance. What Rodriguez discovered was that Flint had indeed been interviewed as part of the original investigation into Angela Martinez. The interview notes indicated that Flint's truck had been seen in the vicinity of the diner around the time Angela finished her shift, and when questioned, he claimed he had been driving through on his way home from a repair job. He had an alibi for the later evening, said he had been working on a car in his garage and a neighbor had stopped by around 8:30 that night, which the neighbor had confirmed. The investigators at the time had found his explanation plausible and moved on to other leads. But now, knowing what Flint had been capable of, knowing that he had successfully hidden Calvin's body for decades in a pit beneath his garage floor, Rodriguez began to wonder if that same garage might hold other secrets. The problem was that the garage no longer existed, had been demolished and cleared away. The ground turned into parkland. Any evidence that might have been there was gone, destroyed by the demolition equipment and excavation process. Rodriguez felt the frustration of being close to potential answers, but unable to reach them, the evidence quite literally removed before anyone knew to look for it. He decided to take a different approach, focusing on what could still be examined rather than what was lost. He obtained the original case file on Angela Martinez and sent everything that might potentially hold DNA evidence to the state lab for reanalysis. A coffee cup that had been found in Angela's car, tested at the time, but with technology that couldn't extract usable results, was re-examined with current methods. Fingerprints that had been lifted from her car door handle were run through updated databases that hadn't existed in 1982, and investigators began re-interviewing people who had known Angela, asking questions that might not have seemed relevant 40 years ago, but could provide context now. The re-investigation into Angela's disappearance was ongoing as of 2027, with some promising leads but no definitive answers yet. Rodriguez remained hopeful that eventually technology would advance enough, or a witness would come forward with information that would crack the case. He kept a photograph of Angela on his desk, next to one of Calvin Brooks, a reminder of why the work mattered, why giving up was never an option. The Calvin Brooks case had also inspired changes in how missing persons cases were handled from the initial report. The Willowbrook Police Department implemented new protocols that required immediate preservation of any physical evidence from a missing person's last known location. Even if the disappearance didn't immediately appear suspicious, items were photographed extensively, DNA samples were collected from personal belongings, and everything was cataloged and stored in climate-controlled facilities that would maintain the integrity of evidence for decades, if necessary. Chief Morrison worked with other law enforcement leaders in Ohio to develop statewide standards for evidence preservation in missing persons cases, using Calvin's case as the example of why such standards were essential. She testified before the state legislature in support of funding for improved evidence storage facilities and training programs for officers on the latest evidence collection techniques. The legislation passed in 2026, allocating $12 million over 5 years for cold case initiatives and evidence preservation infrastructure. The human cost of Calvin's case extended beyond his immediate family to touch countless lives in ways both obvious and subtle. The volunteers who had searched for him in 1976, walking through woods and fields calling his name, many of them carried guilt for decades about not finding him, about failing to bring him home when he might still have been saved. When the truth came out in 2024, some of those former volunteers expressed relief that they hadn't missed anything, that Calvin had been hidden where no search party would have thought to look, but others struggled with renewed grief, the finality of knowing he had been dead all along while they searched. Mary Hutchison had been 16 years old in 1976, a classmate of Calvin's who had joined the search efforts and spent every day after school for 2 weeks looking for him. She had never forgotten the experience, the sense of helplessness and fear, the way Calvin's empty desk at school had seemed to accuse all of them of not doing enough. When she heard the news in 2024 that his remains had been found, she sat down and wrote a letter to Margaret Brooks, apologizing for not finding Calvin all those years ago, expressing the sorrow she had carried for decades. Margaret wrote back, thanking her for the letter and absolving her of any guilt, explaining that the only person responsible for Calvin's death was Warren Flint, that everyone else had done their best with the information they had. The exchange of letters between Mary and Margaret led to a broader conversation within the community about survivors' guilt and the lingering trauma that Calvin's disappearance had caused for people who had lived through it. The Willowbrook Community Center organized a series of support group meetings for anyone who had been affected by the case, providing a space where people could share their experiences and process their emotions with the help of trained counselors. Dozens of people attended, ranging from former classmates of Calvin's to police officers who had worked the original investigation, to parents who had been so frightened by his disappearance that they had changed how they raised their own children. One of the most powerful testimonies at these meetings came from Robert Harrison, who had been Calvin's best friend in junior high. Robert had been 12 in 1976 and had planned to meet Calvin after his paper route that morning to ride bikes to school together. When Calvin never showed up, Robert had assumed he had overslept or forgotten, hadn't realized anything was wrong until he got to school and heard the rumors that Calvin was missing. For 48 years, Robert had wondered if things might have been different if he had gone with Calvin on his paper route that morning, if his presence would have deterred Flint, or if he too would have been victimized. Robert was 60 in 2024, a grandfather with a successful career as an accountant, but the weight of Calvin's absence had shadowed his entire life. He had made it his mission to never lose touch with friends, to always show up when he said he would, to be reliable in ways that honored what he felt he had failed to do for Calvin. When the case was solved and he learned definitively that there was nothing he could have done, that Calvin had been killed shortly after the encounter with Flint, he broke down sobbing at one of the support group meetings, finally releasing decades of misplaced guilt. The ripple effects of the case extended into the realm of policy and advocacy at the national level. Several organizations focused on missing and exploited children reached out to the Brooks family and the Willowbrook Police Department, asking to use the case as an example in their educational and fundraising materials. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children featured Calvin's story in their annual report for 2024, highlighting how advances in forensic science and persistent investigation had brought closure after nearly half a century. Margaret Brooks became an advocate herself, speaking at conferences and events about the importance of supporting families of missing children, not just in the immediate aftermath of a disappearance, but for the long term. She talked about how her mother had struggled to find mental health resources that understood the specific kind of grief that came with not knowing, the ambiguous loss that made it impossible to move forward, but equally impossible to find peace. She pushed for better support systems, for therapists who specialized in this kind of trauma, for financial assistance for families who spent their savings on private investigators and search efforts. Her advocacy work led to the creation of the Patricia Brooks Foundation in 2027, named in honor of her mother and dedicated to supporting families of long-term missing persons. The foundation provided grants for families to access counseling services, helped fund private investigation efforts when law enforcement resources were limited, and lobbied for legislative changes that would improve how missing persons cases were handled. Margaret served as the foundation's president, working with a board of directors that included other family members of missing persons, retired law enforcement officers, and forensic experts. The Foundation's first major initiative was the creation of a national database of unsolved missing persons cases that included not just basic information, but detailed evidence inventories, noting what physical evidence existed and where it was stored. The goal was to make it easier for investigators working cold cases to know what materials were available for retesting as technology advanced. The database launched in 2028 with information on over 3,000 cases, and within the first year, it had contributed to the resolution of 7 cases where investigators discovered evidence they hadn't known existed, stored in warehouses or evidence rooms and forgotten over time. Calvin's case also influenced popular culture in ways that kept his story in public consciousness. A true crime podcast called Buried Truth dedicated an entire season to the case in 2025, conducting extensive interviews with people involved in the investigation, family members, community members, and forensic experts. The podcast was meticulously researched and respectfully done, focusing on Calvin as a person rather than just a victim, and it became one of the most downloaded true crime series of the year. The success of the podcast led to a documentary film, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2027 and was later picked up by a streaming service, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. The documentary, titled 48 Years, used a combination of archival footage, interviews, dramatic reenactments, and forensic animation to tell the story of Calvin's disappearance and the investigation that eventually solved it. Margaret Brooks served as a consultant on the film, ensuring that her brother was portrayed accurately and that the focus remained on the human impact of the crime rather than sensationalizing the violence. The film won several awards and sparked conversations about cold case investigations, victim advocacy, and the advancement of forensic science. In Willowbrook, the high school drama department produced a play in 2029 based on Calvin's story, written by a local playwright who had grown up hearing about the case. The play was called The Root, and it focused on the morning of Calvin's disappearance, the search efforts that followed, and the resolution decades later. It was a challenging production, dealing with heavy themes, but the director worked closely with Margaret Brooks and mental health professionals to ensure it was handled appropriately. The play ran for 2 weeks, and all performances sold out, with proceeds going to the Calvin Brooks Memorial Scholarship Fund, the younger generation in Willowbrook. Those born decades after Calvin's disappearance learned about him through school programs, the Memorial Park, the scholarship in his name, and the various cultural productions his story had inspired. For them, Calvin wasn't a memory, but a historical figure, someone whose story was part of their town's heritage and identity. Many of them took field trips to the Memorial Park as part of their social studies curriculum, learning about the case as an example of how communities respond to tragedy and how justice can be pursued even across decades. The forensic science program at Ohio State University developed a case study based on Calvin's investigation, using it to teach students about evidence preservation, DNA analysis, and the importance of thoroughness in initial crime scene investigation. Professor James Lee, who headed the program, had worked as a consultant on the case's resolution and used his first-hand experience to create detailed lesson plans that walked students through every aspect of the investigation, from the original 1976 work to the 2024 breakthrough. The case study became a standard part of the curriculum and was adopted by other forensic science programs around the country. The technological advances that had made solving Calvin's case possible continued to evolve, promising even more breakthroughs in the future. By 2030, DNA analysis had become so sophisticated that scientists could extract usable profiles from increasingly degraded samples, push back the time window for what was considered testable evidence. New techniques in isotope analysis could determine where a person had lived based on their bone composition, what they had eaten, even what year they had died with increasing accuracy. These tools were applied to cold cases across the country, bringing closure to families who had been waiting as long or longer than the Brooks family had. The investment in cold case investigation that Calvin's case had helped inspire paid dividends in terms of solved cases and brought criminals to justice who thought they had gotten away with their crimes. In Ohio alone, between 2024 and 2030, 32 cold cases were solved using updated forensic techniques, many of them murders from the 1970s and 80s, where DNA evidence had been collected but couldn't be analyzed with the technology available at the time. Each resolution brought closure to a family, answered questions that had haunted people for decades, and in many cases led to criminal charges against perpetrators who were still alive. The story of Calvin Brooks became a touchstone for discussions about patience and persistence in investigation, about never accepting that a case was truly unsolvable, only that it was unsolved with current methods and knowledge. Detective Raymond Pierce's philosophy that every case deserved continued attention and that technology would eventually catch up to provide answers became a guiding principle for cold case investigators. His approach was taught in law enforcement training programs, cited in textbooks, held up as an example of dedication to justice that transcended career limitations and personal convenience. In Willowbrook, the transformation of Warren Flint's property into a memorial park had a profound effect on the community's healing process. What had once been a place of darkness and evil, avoided by most residents, became a space of light and community gathering. The park hosted youth soccer leagues, summer concert series, farmers markets, art fairs, and countless family picnics. Children played on the playground equipment installed in one corner, flew kites in the open grass areas, completely unaware of the dark history beneath their feet. Or, if they were aware, it didn't diminish their joy in the present moment. The annual remembrance ceremony held at Calvin's Memorial each October became one of Willowbrook's most significant community events, drawing crowds that numbered in the hundreds. The ceremony evolved over the years from a somber gathering to something more celebratory, focusing not just on the tragedy of Calvin's death, but on the strength of the community's response, the persistence of those who had sought justice, and the importance of cherishing the time we have with loved ones. Local musicians performed, poets read original works inspired by Calvin's story, and speakers talked about hope and resilience and the power of truth. Margaret Brooks attended every ceremony until her death in 2045 at the age of 77, continuing the tradition her mother had started. In her final years, she expressed satisfaction that Calvin's story had led to so much positive change, that his death, while tragic and senseless, had ultimately motivated improvements in how missing children were searched for, how evidence was preserved, how families were supported. She said she believed Calvin would have approved, that he had been the kind of kid who always wanted to help people, and in a strange way, his story continued to help people long after his life had been cut short. When Margaret passed away, the community turned out in force for her funeral, filling the Methodist church to capacity and spilling out onto the lawn. Speakers praised her advocacy work, her dedication to keeping her brother's memory alive, her efforts to ensure that other families of missing persons received the support and resources they needed. She was buried beside her mother and brother in Willowbrook Cemetery, the 3 headstones forming a row, a family reunited at last. The Calvin Brooks Memorial Scholarship continued to be awarded annually, growing in size as the endowment increased through donations and fundraising events. By 2040, The scholarship had helped send 68 students to college, young people who might not have had the opportunity otherwise and who carried forward Calvin's legacy of responsibility and service. Many of the scholarship recipients stayed connected to Willowbrook, returning after college to work in the community, serving on town councils and school boards, becoming teachers and business owners, and continuing the cycle of giving back. The case also had an impact on how media covered missing persons cases, particularly the missing white woman syndrome that had long plagued journalism. Calvin's story, with its long timeline and eventual resolution, highlighted how any missing person case could become significant. How every victim deserved attention and resources regardless of their background or circumstances. Journalism schools began using the case as a teaching example of responsible crime reporting, discussing how to balance public interest with respect for victims and their families, how to avoid sensationalism while still engaging audiences. As the years passed and Willowbrook continued to grow and change, the story of Calvin Brooks remained a constant, a shared history that bound the community together across generations. New residents learned about him from neighbors, from the memorial in the park, from the scholarship announcements each spring. Longtime residents shared their memories with younger people, creating an oral history that kept Calvin alive in collective memory. And in that remembering, in the telling and retelling of his story, Calvin Brooks transcended being just a victim of a terrible crime and became something more, a symbol of innocence lost but not forgotten, a reminder that every life matters and deserves justice, a call to action that even the longest odds can be overcome with persistence and dedication and advances in science and technology.